It's 9 a.m. Monday morning, and there's a lot of interest. And people have been sending text messages saying they've either reached the wrong place, or it's very crowded outside, or the metro, they're stuck in metro somewhere in Roslyn. Despite the logistics, I think the topic is not that challenging. It's rather a relatively easy topic, and the issues that we have at hand are much more easier. And I'm sure you're welcome to address it, and the audience are going to be very friendly as well. So, without wasting much time, we do appreciate your engagement with the council. We've had a series of engagements in the new year, and you've been very warm and receptive to us. So on behalf of our leadership and the council, we would like to express a deep thanks to you for coming online and on the record for this event. We also want to express a deep sense of thanks to your colleagues, Tyler, as well as Philip Clark, who have been a subject of constant harassment by me and my colleagues to stage this event. And if it's any consolation,
Is that a translation problem?
No.
Harassment's the same everywhere in the world?
Harassment is the same everywhere. And if it's any consolation, it's only going to get worse as the topic gets more intense. So I want to warn you about that. So let me dive straight into the topic. We've had a lot of private exchanges on this, but I want to actually kick off with a couple of questions and lay out the landscape and the topic for more of the audience to entertain you with their questions.
Of course.
So many of you have watched the CBS 60 Minutes last week, and there was a lot of issues laid out on the table about this particular topic per se. And I wanted to ask you, taking that as a starting point, I wanted to ask you to place this into a bigger context about, why have you been a sponsor of this bill? What is the rationale? What drove you to sponsoring such a legislation? And you sponsored a legislation sometime last year, and now you're leading the charge on this legislation. So why don't you start with that?
Well, I think thank you very much. I think when you serve on judiciary, you assume that you're going to do some form of immigration reform every few years. I've served 16 years. This will be the first immigration reform if we successfully make it law. And that brings up the major point, which is that H1 and other high skills and investors visas were all passed at various times 20 and 25 years ago for the last updates, and they were passed as though they were going to be revisited every year or two. There was no indexing for inflation. There was no mechanism to increase or, if appropriate, decrease numbers and categories. And as a result, there were a number of visas who, if you take them at a stamp in time, 20 or 25 years ago, in the case of H1, 1998, there's nothing particularly wrong with the calculation. Although in 1998, for a short period of time, the H1 visas were dramatically greater than the 65,000 available today. But as far as the requirements, the system worked reasonably well. But 25 years is a long time. And in 25 years, the expectation of pay for everyone in this room, with whatever degree level you have, and Doctor, I will take yours, in 1998, were you making $60,000?
I hadn't graduated then at all.
So you were dreaming and you were harassing people about possibly making $60,000.
That's true. Yeah.
Today, would you work for $60,000? You don't need to answer that.
No.
And that's the reality, is that we act as though $60,000, the threshold for essentially not having to make a case for high skill, is an absurd level. A graduate with a STEM degree from any university, virtually anywhere in the world, but certainly in the US, is not going to take a job for $60,000 with the possible exception of being an intern in one of my offices. And that's the reality, is that the product we know as H1 is oversubscribed by dozens of times, if the truth be known. The reason that the visas disappear in the first few hours is that, in fact, you have an, if you will, elasticity of demand, to use an economic term. You have way too low a price for way too valuable a product. And that's really the simple reason for needing to change it sooner, is to rebalance who gets those based on a fair assessment of their value.
So let me.
By the way, in 2013, I was doing a much broader bill that included some of these features, and it was well liked because it expanded the number of H1s, which ultimately should be a goal, is to have the number of high-skilled visas match the critical needs.
I was going to come to that. Yeah. And also, let me put this into context. There are several competing bills aimed at reforming the H1B. And you've talked to us, and at one level, you even said this in itself is a compromise bill. And please talk to us more about this bill. And there are some critics who allege that your bill does not comprehensively reform the immigration system.
Oh, of course it doesn't. It is a single, very sharp razor that cuts just one part of a mustache. This is a single problem, and the bill is a single solution to one problem, which is it simply would raise the expectation of wages likely to be received by individuals being recruited to come to America, or the critical shortage would have to be demonstrated. It's that simple. Today, 75% or so of all H1s are coming in at about the $60,000, $65,000 level, which is pretty absurd considering these are high-skilled visas. Well, many companies, and we could name a host of them, but let's just say most of Silicon Valley, if they were told write a $100,000 check and you'll get your H1, they would write the $100,000 check plus benefits. So, many people are talking about other bills, but they're trying to fix other problems. This one is narrow. I'd like to do more, and I will be reintroducing Skills Visa, which is designed to move us toward a better balance of where our approximately 1.2 million immigrant visas go. But let's remember, this is a non-immigrant visa, so fixing a non-immigrant visa doesn't require that you fix the whole immigrant system.
And the impacts of the American economy on the American economy?
It can only be positive. Yeah. If you bring in people at $65,000, you bring in a less valuable worker than if you bring in a $120,000 worker. Now, anyone who would say otherwise would have to argue with virtually every economist on the face of the earth. We bring in, for example, over 50,000 people on the lottery. They come in with very few skills. Sometimes they're unemployable. Now, nobody's going to compare the diversity visa with the H1, nor should you compare the H1 at 60,000 or 65,000 with the likely person that's going to be recruited for 2 or 3 times that. So raising the floor only raises the likelihood of the quality of position that's going to be filled.
And is there a particular study that you refer to on the American economy, the impacts on the American economy, short, long term, or medium term?
For such a small fix, I have to be candid.
Yeah.
I wasn't through my freshman year of economics before I knew this one was an easy call. And that's why I say that I defy anyone to have an economic model that shows that a $60,000 worker is more valuable than a $100,000 worker. I will challenge everyone in the room to ask a question as though they believe that to be true.
Sure. I want to throw it open to the audience and invite if there are any questions. I have some more questions on my list, but if there are any questions, this is your chance.
I actually have 3.
Good, you get 1.
Yeah. Please identify and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Hildinger Mohanty. I'm on an H1B visa. I came to the US in 2000. The way things are looking right now, I am unlikely to get my green card for the next 30 years. And I've had several opportunities pass me by, jobs, entrepreneurship opportunities. And what are you going to do to fix this issue? Because people are waiting 30, 70 years to get green cards. And you just spoke about the Skills Visa Act, which just increases the H1B number by, it looks like, at least 100,000. But you're not adding that many green cards to the system. So, I mean, how?
Okay, it's a very valid question. The Skills Visa also lifted the per country cap. But the answer is, without a more comprehensive reform, you have a 30-year wait because you come from a country that is overly successful in gaining H1Bs. If you came from Canada, you'd have one in 18 months or 2 years. That's the current law. The current law obviously makes a distinction between, if you will, countries with very few people applying and countries with a lot. So I think that's a status quo that isn't going to change without a more comprehensive bill. And it's going to have to fix a number of areas beyond just H1B. But it is an area that in 2013 our bill did address, and it is still a goal. But lifting the per country cap at this point, it makes very little sense in a non-immigrant visa, because this is about a visa, quite frankly, in which at the end of 5 years you should have returned to your country. You're here because you asked to be in a line, not because you're an H1. Really, the H1 only gave you an ability to come here and work. It didn't give you a pathway to green card and citizenship. No, I understand. It gave you an ability to apply.
Well, yes, but the implicit promises, the implicit contract is that you're going to get it in a reasonable amount of time.
Well, you know, in 2000, the list, it was a very long list. So, you know, I'm not going to have an argument with anybody on what's wrong with the system, but that part of the system was wrong in '98. It's wrong today. But again, H1B, which is a subject for today, is a non-immigrant visa. And fixing a non-immigrant visa has a lot to do with who you bring and whether they fulfill the skills that are requested. In my home district, I have more slots today being filled by unlawful residents in the country in farming than there are H1B slots in America. I mean, that's just the reality that in greater San Diego, there are more than 50,000 people working illegally. Now, there's an H2A, which is supposed to supply on-time guest workers, truly guest seasonal workers, but it doesn't. It fails. So are there lots of areas that need to be addressed? Absolutely. But let me just broaden the subject, because I think the gentleman brought it up very well. The subject of America's immigration policy is a great subject to bring up, because there's a great debate. Do we continue to take family reunification, which, by the way, is part of that backlog by certain countries, as a priority? Or do we take principal, if you will, points-driven applicants as our priority? If you assume 1.2 million people will become legal immigrants, permanent residents in this country per year, and have a pathway to citizenship, what should the makeup of that be? Should it be mostly brothers, sisters, parents, children, relations of others, plus some lottery? Or should it be driven the way Canada, Britain, and other countries do, none of which are as generous in immigration as we are, by a point system that gives education, youth, particular job skills as an advantage? And that's a debate that's beyond today, but it's a debate that almost answers itself if you have an economic model you're trying to drive.
Yashwant? Yeah.
Yeah, wait for the mic, please.
Yeah.
Sure. Yashwant Raj, Hindustan Times. Congressman, two questions. One, what are the chances of this bill becoming law? One.
President supports it. We think we'll have strong support in the Senate. You know, you mentioned 60 Minutes. If you believe what 60 Minutes said was accurate, then it's a travesty not to address it. But we commit travesties by omission all the time around here. So I always tell people that you know, the chances of a turtle on a beach getting to the ocean without being eaten by a crab are actually better than the chances of a piece of legislation becoming law. But like the thousands of turtles that head for the ocean, I happened to watch that last night. It's the only reason I've got it stuck in my mind. But we have numbers. We keep doing it. I've been working on this legislation for a long time. This is a spin-off of a larger piece where we couldn't get consensus. And do I want to pass this alone? Yes. Do I want to pass skills visa? Yes. Can we pass both in time? We will.
Second, in your previous 2013 bill, you had talked about expanding the program, which you have dropped from this bill. Any particular reason?
Yeah, the reason you can't expand it is it's being abused. I note that there are a lot of Indian Americans in this room. 60 Minutes made it clear. You can't have 75% of a program going to Indian-owned, Indian-operated, Indian employee visas and not say there's a distortion. Now, in fairness, the so-called diversity or lottery, the 50,000 slots, the late Ted Kennedy intended those to be for Irish. So, things go various ways. At the end of this reform, will it still be disproportionately from a few countries who are willing to give up their high-skilled, motivated workers to leave their country and work here? Yes. Will it be as extreme as it is? No. Here's the other part of it, though, and your question begs a better answer. The reason that we were expanding H1B significantly in 2013 is we were doing the reforms to give people a belief that we were, in fact, pushing to get the best and the brightest. That bill also had a green card system for American STEM graduates from American universities with STEM degrees. And it did so because it was broadly and still is understood that we let a lot of very talented, well-educated people leave the United States every year for no particular valid reason. It also expanded medical doctors who graduate from U.S. universities, their ability to remain here. I'm committed to all of those because I'm a businessman by background, and it just makes common sense that if you tell me I can hire 1.2 million people, so to speak, that I'm going to hire as many of the best and the brightest as I can. I'm going to hire the people who can build my company. Now, some of them will build it at the top end. Not all will. You may need other skills. Right now, believe it or not, we need people who know how to create vinyl records, because our children are now buying retro vinyl records, and we had no one to go back into production. So it's not always about somebody with the bio and pharma and electronic skills and programmers, but right now the greatest tragedy are the amount of people who would like to come here, who have education and skills, who are being told that their chances are about 1 in 100 if they get on this list. Or people who come here with skills and then find themselves waiting so long that they really feel like they're not being appreciated in the country that welcomed to come work. So solving both of those is beyond the scope of this bill. The scope of this bill is somewhat to regain the confidence that I didn't have anything to do with the 60 Minutes presentation, but you could see how people don't have confidence in this bill after they saw 60 Minutes. I wanted to avert that a year ago so that people would have confidence. If you have confidence in the bill, if you're bringing the best and the brightest, then candidly, you should be able to raise the numbers because people believe we must need those skills. Today, they don't believe it. You cannot have some of the examples, University of California, San Francisco, or Southern California, Edison. You can't have workers of reasonable skill, not extremely high skill, but reasonable skill, who are being told to train people who are working for half the amount, and then they're laid off. Now, those are facts, not fiction. Those are the kinds of undeniable facts that cause the American people to doubt the accuracy and the validity of this program. And that's what this bill does, is quickly try to say, we can prove in 1 year that we still have hundreds of thousands of applicants for jobs that are not similar to the ones lost at Southern California, Edison, or University of California, San Francisco. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, this is Shailesh Kumar from Eurasia Group. This is a topic that affects the Indian government because they, to an extent, because they're concerned that some of their industries might be affected by it. Do you think there's opportunities or rooms to use H1B reform as a way of negotiating with India? So, for example, linking the topic to asking India to open up its consumer market more. Because the argument is that if U.S. has a fluid labor market, India has a dynamic consumer market, so maybe the two can go hand in hand.
Let me piggyback that question. I got
Sure.
back from India on Saturday, and certain quarters, some analysts allege that this is an unfair target on them too. So I just want to piggyback and couple that question.
Well, I remember years ago I had an IndyCar team, and we were finishing in the bottom half most of the time of the teams, and Roger Penske was winning every race. And he had traction control, and none of the rest of us had traction control on our race cars. And so the next year, everyone had figured out how to get traction control, and they were getting ready to put them on. And Roger Penske then went before the committee and said, we got to get rid of traction control. It's unsafe because it's causing people to go too fast. After he'd won virtually all the races in a season. I think it's interesting that India would be concerned that a relatively simple change that does not target India, but affects India, somehow would cause there having to be an accommodation for India. If India's been winning because 3/4 of the slots have gone to Indian-owned, Indian-operated organizations who hire virtually only people from India, and they use it as a leverage, not just for consulting and work, but actually they use it in order to move vast amounts of work into India, use the H1 worker as, if you will, a conduit for that. Well, then that was a business plan that built on a flawed system, one that if it had been indexed for inflation, simply indexed for inflation, it would be where my bill put it. And so I think when you look at simply moving the portion of the bill that moves it from 60 to 100,000, I don't think there can be any accommodation. Certainly a master's degree has become less valuable. We could negotiate whether that master's degree from a U.S. university in the STEM field would still be a waiver. But I think that we certainly have to tighten up the definition of the part that is currently eliminated. And I've talked to people about whether or not someone graduating from the University of California or University of Michigan with a computer science programming master's shouldn't get up, if you will, a fast one. But I think where you do have an opportunity with India and South Korea, just to use another country, because we've been sort of talking one country for a moment. There are other countries who are looking for more opportunities, who have a large population, China also, of very well-educated people who would like to have these opportunities. I think when you look at a comprehensive bill or a more comprehensive, high-skilled one, absolutely, there can be opportunities. In the case of South Korea, and I'll keep using that one, they feel like Australia got some dedicated, in their free trade agreement, some dedicated slots that gave them a very easy ability for Australians to come here. And they feel like they, on a per capita basis, were shortchanged. I've had that conversation. We haven't been able to accommodate, but the point was good, which is do trade deals, particularly when they tear down barriers. Are they a good opportunity to also create mobility, greater mobility of labor? Absolutely, and I think that if there is some sort of a trade agreement, immigration, or at least immigration slots and guest worker slots, or if you will, slots for companies that are involved in that trade, absolutely should be considered. Yes, sir.
Tom Timber, consultant. Have you considered what the likely implications are likely to be if the bill is passed in terms of, for example, of activity being moved to Vancouver, which the Financial Times has had things about, or in fact, simply taking the activities and instead of bringing people here, just increasing the amount of offshoring? Is there any estimate of what the actual impact would be?
That's a great question, and I think the simple answer is that if you have 60,000, 65,000 slots that get filled every year, whether you have 10,000 or 10 million applicants who don't get the slots they ask for, the ones who don't get are going to consider other options, including offboarding. And so that's a question of, do we fully fill or nearly fully fill the desire? So your question is a great one because at 65,000, which is an arbitrary number, as would any other number that wasn't based on the known or definable shortage, always causes a certain amount of work to go elsewhere. And so raising the dollar, as long as all 65,000 slots get consumed, no, it won't. It won't cause any offboarding. But anytime somebody doesn't get it, that will be the offboarding. And I think the important point there is, if I bring in a top scientist, they by definition will probably create, and there are studies on how many, but they will create additional job opportunities by their progress, their activities. If you bring someone at the bottom, they don't have a multiple. They are that entity. So there's no question at all. If we bring in the next Albert Einstein, to use an example, you're going to create whole industries, which creates demand and additional employment. And if you come down here, as you come down the scale, it's going to be less until it's essentially that person gets a job, or in the case Southern California Edison, displaces a job. So it's no net gain at all. But I think your question is great, which is we need to change our system from one that has an arbitrary number to one that has truly a demand number. And if we set a goal, and this would still be arbitrary, but there'd be a study to support it, at 80, 85, 90, 95% of shortage, so that you don't eliminate the price pressure, but you reduce the failure and thus the offboarding, you do a lot for our economy. And again, for anyone that's ever been in my position of having a few pieces of electronics that were selling really hot one year, you know that if you, sort of like the Corvette, where they try to underproduce by just a little so that everyone pays full list, you underproduce by a little and you get a lot of demand and hype. You overproduce and the price will potentially go down. You underproduce by too much and you give a competitor an opportunity to simply make those sales and build a market. We need to have a system that has the elasticity to go from 65,000 to 200,000 in high demand times, but then ratchet back down if we're in a recession for a year or two so that we don't oversupply. That's the system I think that you're referring to, and it's one we need to do, and I think all of us need to work on that in any more comprehensive. And I don't use the word comprehensive as everything. I use it comprehensive of high skills certainly can be considered comprehensive and affect hundreds of thousands of visas without it having to deal with everything. And the agricultural immigration and worker program also could be considered comprehensive without having to deal with everything. And I think when you look at breaking them down into like industries, you find a better ability to have that discussion about where are we losing American jobs because we don't meet demand. Yes, ma'am, if we can get her a microphone.
Thank you, Congressman. My name is Yo-Yo from Hong Kong Phoenix TV. I'm a reporter, and I also studied in the States before.
Where'd you go to school?
Johns Hopkins University.
I couldn't get in there.
So, as you said, it's a very good university. I don't think I'm not the brightest people you referred, but in this industry, it's not, for entry-level job, it's never gonna be $60,000 per annual income. So what would you say to people like me, and also a lot of Chinese students, except STEM, there have been increasing number of Chinese students studying in other areas in the US. What would you say to them when they realize probably there won't be a job waiting for me after I graduate, and what would they do?
Well, you have that problem whether you're in Kowloon or you're here. The problem of did you choose a profession which has demand, global demand. Now, obviously you're sitting here as a global journalist. If you went back to Hong Kong, you might not be able to get a job in your same profession. You're here because there's a job, you have a skill, and there's a demand. The same is true. I mean, and I won't question anyone in this room who decided to get a political science degree or an English degree or a physical education degree. But people do that all the time and then are shocked to find out that those are not necessarily going to find them jobs with their education being used directly. So in the case of H1, it is defined as a high skill. Now, high skill typically means hard to get, few to have, and much needed. Now, that's not always the case. When I was a young man, we went through a period of time in which aeronautical engineers actually were being laid off, and they were out. This was so. Yes, I agree. Many people found themselves moving to other professions, and it was a tragedy because a few years later, we needed those aeronautical engineers back. And so, first of all, remember, H1 is not a dollar figure only calculation. If you advertise for a job that is definable as a skilled job, and you can't find that person, you can still apply for it. What we're talking about in raising it is raising sort of the automatic process that allows somebody to be brought in, if you will, with less of the paperwork. But I think your point is a good one, which is H1 for everyone? Should we have other categories? And frankly, we do. We have a number of other specific skills areas, for example, actors and musicians. We have a whole separate guest worker program for those. And so I think, again, this goes back to the complexity of the immigration system. When you look at immigrant visas and you set them over there, and you're now in the immigrant visa line, that's 1.2 million, more or less, a year. And we have a very complex system of who gets in the line and the eligibility. On the other hand, in non-immigrant visa, we have a lot of categories. The question is, are they elastic enough? If we look at tourism, we have an unlimited amount of people who can come here as tourists. There's still a procedure, but basically, if you want to go to Disneyland, let everyone in. And I only say that because that's a non-immigrant visa. And if we have never had to have a cap on that, why would we have a cap on scientists who would be able to add to our economy? And so the same concept has to be in play. But thank you for your question, because I think everyone who's going to school has to ask, are they taking the studies that are going to give them a job in the place they want to be? And that may be a tough one for some people.
So if I understand your bill correctly, correct me if I'm wrong here. If there are certain skill sets that are very rare and is needed much by the American economy, but the salary that a company or a firm can afford to pay them is not to the level of 100,000, there is still procedures available.
Yeah, you can still, one of the things people forget is what we're doing is we're making the shortcut system tougher. If you have, let's just say you need a computer programmer in Mobile, Alabama, and that person does COBOL, a lost language, but not to the government, and you advertise and you can't find somebody, and you're offering what appears to be a perfectly good prevailing wage, and you have 5 employees that do it, but you need a 6th, you're still going to be able to apply for it. So that's not the problem. The problem, quite frankly, has been the shortcutting of not having to do quite that level of showing of proof. And again, back to your question, sir, gentleman behind you, if all 65,000 slots still disappear in a matter of hours, we're only dealing with, from a selection of hundreds of thousands of people that companies would like to have, which 65,000 gets them. And we're looking at moving the 65,000 up the salary scale. It won't move it automatically to everyone gets 200 or 100, no matter what we set, but it's going to dramatically reduce the amount of 65,000s. And 60 Minutes made the point that this was the lion's share, that we had gotten to where 75% of these H1s were going to people not only from India and disproportionately, but they were going at this rate, at this relatively low amount. And if it goes from an average, let's say, of 85,000 blended to an average of 110,000 blended, where's the loss? The workers are making more. They may be different workers, but we're still going to run out of those slots. And I think that's the important thing. And again, my skills visa bill, which will be reintroduced in a few weeks, and I hope everyone's as animated toward getting people to sign on to it and engage in the process, is designed to deal with the 65,000 cap being artificial, deal with the pathway for people who remained for green cards and citizenship, and deal with the other areas of high skill that we're not doing enough of, including medical doctors. I'm not in charge here. The guy with the mic's in charge.
So one of the issues with the H1B is when you get laid off, you get fired, or you even get sick, you have to pack your bags, sell your car. If you own a house, sell the house, and leave. This gives your employer a tremendous amount of leverage over you. In fact, being on an H1B this long, I feel more like an indentured servant than an employee, because that's kind of what it's like. So, how would you fix that? Because that is a core part of the abuse, right? Because if you just put a dollar number on the salary, an indentured servant is an indentured servant is an indentured servant. It doesn't matter what you pay them. So how would you address that part of the issue?
Well, and this is an additional challenge we have in all non-immigrant guest visas, is that historically we've tried to have the employer-employee be a relationship. And that's a reform that probably needs to happen. But I will say that, again, the Indian consulting firms that were shown, or any consulting firm where you're not the direct employee, and I have we call him a nephew, but he's like a second cousin of mine, who came from Lebanon as a programmer and ended up working for AT&T, but through a consulting firm. And in spite of what 60 Minutes said, you have people from Syria, from Lebanon, from other places that it's not exclusively any one country. And they paid him $60,000 the first year, and they cut his pay the second year or told him to go home. He took the pay cut because even though he was working for a well-known company's name, he was through a consulting firm that kind of owned his H1. That's a reform that is beyond the scope of this bill, but it's not a reform beyond the skills visa. And by the way, the same thing has to happen. I keep mentioning agricultural, but think about it. If you're a farm worker, and it's valid to say if you don't have a job, you can't stay here on a guest worker. But there's no logical reason that in any skill, and I'll take ag on the other end, that an agricultural worker who comes to work for a farmer, but then the farmer decides to not treat him well or in some other way, shouldn't be able to go to the farm down the street. That's the American way. And so converting our systems from a shortage recognizing a worker instead of an employer recognizing the shortage and then sort of owning the worker is a reform that would be tough, but it's a reform that I think we need to put into the bills to allow more portability. I will tell you that many of the greatest users of H1B will object to greater portability, but it is something that I expect will be in the final draft of the Skills Visa Act. And I've already got it in the agricultural and the other end, because there more than any other area, we do need to recognize that if 80% of our ag workers are going to, or maybe 90% are going to be immigrant or non-immigrant visa holders, then we really ought to allow the market to work ordinarily and simply put them into the market. But I think your point is good. Hopefully you'll write on that, because it's something that a lot of people don't know. They don't know that the worker next to them is in fact in peril of being sent home if they just do anything to upset whoever controls their visa.
Congressman, on the matter of greater portability, the current system allows you to find another job.
Yes.
With the same H1B if the skill sets are consistent.
And if they and if they've demonstrated the shortage.
If they've demonstrated, if they want to move into a new firm. But what do you mean by?
It's a very risky wrong, you go home. That's why a lot of
Yeah.
people find a good employer and they stick there and they green card.
And,
It's a very abusive system.
Yeah, there's,
So in-
essentially, the problem with the system is there's an investment by the employer to apply and get an H1. Then the employee, who has nothing to do with the investment, would like to have portability. There's an in-between, because the reality is that if I'm an employer and I'd love to have you work for me, but I didn't do any H1 and I can just pick you up, and the employer who went through all the process is the loser, that system is going to fall apart. So there has to be a middle ground. You're right that the current system does have theoretical portability. I will tell you that my nephew ended up getting married, so he took care of his problem the other way. They have 2 kids. They've been married for more than a decade. But the fact is that he lived in peril trying to secretly, because he couldn't take a day off,
Sure.
because otherwise he could lose his job, to be looking for another job because he had a contract where he didn't know whether he was going to have it the next year, and he was trying to hedge his bet. So I think we all understand one thing better today, and many of you are already experts. This is a complex system with lots of areas that need to be improved, that need to be made more fair to the guest worker, more fair to the guest worker who wants to become an immigrant, and to be candid, more fair to the American people to have this, if you will, program bring more of the intended folks for that particular slot. Let me just close with one thing. Compared to EB5, which has 10,000 slots and are simply being sold for citizenship, and it goes directly to green cards, this program is not that broken. We can fix it, we can show that it's good, and we can expand it. So when I look at all the various immigration areas, this is one where small fixes, ones that do not automatically say to any group that they're cut out of the process, can work. But I would ask everyone to realize that today we probably hit 10 areas beyond the scope of just at what level does somebody come here on an H1B, and that demonstrates how the system has to be changed to be more automatic. It can't be a system that you look at every 25 years and then are surprised when over decades programs stop working the way they were intended to.
So in some sense, the bill also protects the guest workers, because at least they're not abused for the price that they're owed.
Exactly, and just the fact that I learned personally from my nephew that you could be brought in at one salary, but there was no prohibition from the next year of getting paid less, told me that this was one in which most employers are not abusive, but the system doesn't particularly protect the guest worker. And as the gentleman here, and probably others in the room know of examples, those who come here knowing that most H1B temporary workers are really coming here to be permanent workers. And most employers, particularly direct employers, intend for these workers to be permanent workers. Qualcomm in my hometown puts in the application on behalf of every H1 the day they arrive. There's no question that they're hiring them with an intent to be permanent. And the decade-long or longer waits have to be dealt with. And that's where fixing the system and lifting per-country caps are going to have to both occur and occur soon.
Did you have something? Yeah.
I thought Congressman was.
Well, I was wrapping up, but that's the way it works here sometimes.
Thanks so much, Congressman. In your remarks, in response to a question earlier, you said Indian companies were gaming the system. So how much of this bill is aimed at making it difficult for Indian companies to bring in workers on lower wages?
Zero. None of this is intended to. And that's why when you look at the face of a very simple bill, where yes, we are having to deal with H1 dependent as a definition, and Indian companies are not exclusive, but I think as 60 Minutes pointed out, it is so dramatic a sector of the users that it's hard not to mention. By raising the amount, are we helping Facebook, who is nearly H1 dependent under the definition? Are we helping them if they're willing to say, yeah, we'll take advantage of some of these $100,000? Yes. Will we eliminate some of those? Yes. I mean, when we looked at Southern California Edison, it's in my district and I'm very familiar with them, no rules were broken. Everything was done by the book. But American workers were directly laid off. American workers could have been recruited, and the price that was paid for that subcontractor's workers was dramatically less than the perceived market in the area in which these people worked. So we saw a failure that was well documented, but no violation of the law. And the loophole was, quite frankly, the $60,000 number that allowed the company not to have to justify the actual shortage, which didn't exist. So if you can show the shortage and recruit the workers, you're not going to have a problem. If you can pay the higher amount, you don't have to do the ladder attestation. You'll notice I don't say that because I have a terrible time with that word, attestation. But that's where we're making a minor change. I don't think it's going to affect Indian companies as much as Indian companies operating in this space are going to up their game some. But I would suspect that the ratios will be more similar after the passage of this bill than people think. And by the way, on day one, we're still going to run out of slots. And as long as that stays at 65,000, I would expect that annually it's going to be a rush to the lottery. Now, my colleague Zoe Lofgren and I had been working on if you will, a competitive bidding system. Now, that would have a profound effect on people who were hoping to get, if you will, people at a lower salary level, because the goal that we had agreed to was that there would be multiple rounds, and the first round would take the top, let's say 10 or 20%, based on how much you were bidding to pay. And that would mean that if you came in with a $200,000 worker, you were going to get them in the first round. And a few weeks later or a month later, there'd be a second round. In the second round, if everyone bid $180,000, the $60,000 would never get there. And I think both Zoe and I believe that if you were looking at a scarce resource and you wanted to allocate it most appropriately, if you will, an auction system is not a bad way to go. I mean, how many of you own a home, personally own a home? How many would like to sell it for $60,000? Oh, it's worth more than that. Well, then would you like to sell it for the maximum price that it's worth? These slots to employers are worth different amounts. Why wouldn't we find the highest bidder? Now, this bill doesn't do that. It doesn't go that far. But I think when we look at who the 1.2 million people that get to come to be Americans broadly, we would like to have it be, if you will, a little bit of a bidding process and a little less of a lottery process. Now, that doesn't mean that if someone's fleeing tyranny, persecution, or maybe death, that we just see how much they could afford to be paid. But it does mean that out of 1.2 or more million slots, that the ones that are coming, if you will, on merit should be about merit. And I think everyone that studied immigration to other countries, and Canada was mentioned, Canada has a point system. Australia has a point system. And it does matter. By the way, they also have an age preference. And I'm not saying we go to that completely, but I would love to see 500,000 of that 1.2 million be people who have a lot to offer the United States, in addition to ambition, which most immigrants have, be put to the front of the line whenever possible. I think that's good for our economy, and it's good for the perception of immigrants. Not all those slots would be that way. Some of the slots would always end up being people who are coming here or fleeing impossible situations elsewhere.
Congressman, thank you
Thank
very
you very
much. We look forward to working with you in addressing this important issue.
Excellent.
Please
Thank you.
consider the council your friend.
I do.
Thank you.